Welcome back. You're watching Velshi and Rule. And today, like many others, the White House is in chaos. But the question is why? President Trump angrily lashing out at world leaders while tensions in the West Wing are boiling over. Several staffers apparently, and we've heard this before, on the verge of being fired. That includes Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen, Chief of Staff John Kelly, Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross, and a woman you've never heard of, Mira Riekerdahl. She's deputy to the National Security Advisor, John Bolton. In a very, very rare public rebuke, First Lady Melania Trump is demanding Riekerdahl's firing. Sources telling NBC News that she infuriated the First Lady by interfering with her plans for her first solo overseas trip last month. The hostility in the White House is so remarkable that one former Trump aide described it to Politico like this. It is like an episode of Maury. The only thing that is missing is a paternity test. I mean, that's not a nice thing to say about our White House. I want to bring in Anna Palmer, senior Washington correspondent for Politico, and Eli Stokols, White House reporter for the Los Angeles Times. Eli, I want to know, remember that White House person who was saving us from Trump, the one who wrote that anonymous op-ed in the New York Times? Where are they now? You wrote, Trump has retreated into a cocoon of bitterness and resentment. I mean, that's an aggressive statement. Where are you getting that?
Well, I've heard from a lot of people that the president in recent days has been sort of walling himself off, and when people come in, get in his way, he lashes out at them, whether he's snapping at low-level aides or at world leaders who are calling him while he's on Air Force One. The president is just in a foul mood from every conversation that I've had with people in the White House, people who have been speaking with him since the election. And you're seeing that you've seen him really pull back, not be nearly as public or as enthusiastic as omnipresent as he had been in the weeks leading up to the election. And there are other reports that he is considering a lot of changes, and there are so many personnel problems inside the White House, so many people that this president would like to see gone, that it's almost difficult for him to figure out, it seems, where to start. Okay, well, there's a lot of people in the White House, Anna, cabinet members, for example, whose names we know. Mira Riekerdahl, until yesterday, I had never heard of this woman in my life. Now, she is one of the highest-ranking women in the Trump administration, but she's never even met First Lady Melania Trump. Why on earth would there be a public statement from the First Lady, who rarely makes public statements, calling for Mira Riekerdahl's firing? I don't get what's going on.
I mean, it is pretty shocking, frankly. This isn't President Trump, who likes to tweet some of his emotions on the regular. Melania Trump
His wife doesn't.
His wife does not. She keeps a very private, low profile, even for a first lady. This all goes back to the foreign trip where Mira Riekerdahl and the First Lady's staff clashed on several different occasions about funding, also about seating arrangements on the plane. And it just goes to show that, you know, usually these kinds of disputes, trying to get in front of, or, you know, kind of when you get into the family issues, the staff usually loses. And unfortunately, this president and this first lady weren't able to, it doesn't appear, come to an agreement, you know, over pillow talk or over dinner, and are doing this kind of fight in public.
But why would they? Eli, take me inside the White House. When Ali Velshi and I get in arguments, we don't then wait until we're on live TV and tell the world. Why would she do this? First Lady Melania Trump could just turn to her husband and say, let's get that lady out.
Well, there's a good chance she's made those comments privately, perhaps felt like they weren't being heard. But it's hard to speculate. I mean, it's also hard to just ask that question, why? Why are these things happening when it comes to this White House? They happen because there's no process. There's a lot of dysfunction. There's a lot of backstabbing. Those are generally the reasons that we see things that we wouldn't see in better functioning organizations, businesses, administrations. You just wouldn't see all these things leak out. Not only did this happen yesterday, it came as there were a lot of leaks about the president wanting to replace Chief of Staff John Kelly, coming from the sort of opposite sides of the West Wing, behind the people who would like that job, whether it's Nick Ayers or Mick Mulvaney. There's just so much of this going on. There are problems with the Interior Secretary facing ethics probes, considerations about replacing him at some point. Again, there's just a lot of problems inside the West Wing right now.
Okay, but my question is, why the leaks all of a sudden? Anna, the three of us all talk to the White House. We know when Operation Chaos is underway, they're often looking to distract us. Could this be that there are coming indictments in the next few days? The president would get the heads up. It seems odd that every which window in the White House is leaking information right now.
think it's probably two things. One, I think the midterm election didn't go as well as the president had hoped it would. Yes, he was able to get some victories in the Senate, but really in the House, obviously we were learning more and more about this blue wave as the races come in. And certainly there is a lot of rumblings that Robert Mueller is going to be handing down indictments, that kind of quiet period around the election is now over. You saw that right away when he fired his attorney general, trying to put in an appointee that is going to be much more probably in the line with his thinking and kind of do his political bidding for him. And so, yeah, I mean, I think this is really, whenever you're totally right, whenever there is something that the president doesn't want to focus on, there's usually a trial balloon or some kind of other drama that comes out of this White House.
Well, we'll soon find out. Only time will tell. In the meantime, there's a whole lot of headlines for the three of us. Anna, Eli, thank you both so much. We're going to leave it there.
Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.